introduce themselves and mention how they are driving innovation within the sourcing community. Amanda, I'm going to go ahead and start with you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for the lovely introduction, and thank you for having us as one of the sponsors for this series. So I'm Amanda Prochaska. I'm the CEO and president of HPP Inc. and Global Women Procurement Professionals. So we are grateful to be here today. HPP is all about helping your suppliers become better suppliers. And throughout the crisis, we've been helping them get access to much needed funds through the Paycheck Protection Program. So we've been happy to help over 800 different suppliers through this crisis, so they can be there to serve you long term. On the GWPP side, we are also doing a webinar series. In fact, we have one this week, and we are happy to be bringing insights for women in procurement and men in procurement to empower everyone to live their best careers. So stay tuned, check us out on GWPP, and we hope you join us too.
Thanks, Amanda. And GWPP is very active on LinkedIn, so if you're not already a part of the GWPP community, I recommend checking out and joining that group. Next, we have Eric joining us from Rapid Ratings.
Hey, thanks so much, Sarah, and we're happy to be a sponsor and be part of the procurement community and foster the conversation. And so just a little bit around Rapid Ratings. We've been setting the standard for financial health transparency between business partners, and we're leading enterprise and financial risk in terms of providing insights. And so we provide sophisticated analysis into the financial health of both public and private companies in over 140 countries. And so we recently launched our FHR network to really spurred on innovation around suppliers to see their financial health rating and then share it with one or more buyers or with one of their customers. So we have basically predictive and prescriptive analytics, that we provide into these suppliers and vendors. So for more information, visit rapidratings.com, and happy to be a part of this. Thanks, Sarah.
Eric. All right, next we've got Brian joining us from his home office.
Hey, everybody. Brian Dugan, Worldwide Services. Really happy to be a part of this series. We specialize in helping companies directly save money through things like third-party maintenance and support of networking equipment, routing, switching, server storage. So alternatives, I would say, to the traditional approach of getting support for all your network infrastructure from OEMs like Cisco. We are a worldwide provider of service and support as a third-party vendor on that same equipment. So anybody looking to drive significant savings to their departments who are responsible for the technology sourcing side, that's definitely something that we help people out every day, and we do free analysis and recommendations at no cost to the customers on what we think we would recommend they do to leverage third-party maintenance to help them save money. And obviously Sarah and the relationships that she brings and the education she brings is something that we think is invaluable to the procurement community, and we're just happy to be a part of it. So thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Brian. We've got Carolyn joining us from her horse farm in Kentucky.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you. It's a rainy horse farm today. Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Simkowski. I work at Cindertrade. We're a SaaS procurement software provider, global company. We have offices in about 22 or 23 countries now. And we offer a full set of procurement software, everything from source S to P, so source to contract and procure to pay. And we're trying to bring innovation into it now by sort of being on the leading edge of RPA and introducing RPA into our offerings. So that's robotic process automation, if you don't know what that stands for. And we're just very happy to be co-hosting this with Sarah as well.
Thank you, Carolyn. We're going to close out our sponsorship intros with Manish at Techwison, and he's joining us from, I forget, Manish, where are you joining us from today? You and your brother, I always get mixed up.
Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Yes, okay.
First of all, good afternoon, everyone. Second, thank you so much to all the panelists for joining on this talk. We need your experience, your expertise, and your suggestions. TechWisen is a workforce management and consulting company where we partner with clients on 5 technology statement of work. And wherever we cannot do the statement of work, we try to staff their projects. We are located in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My brother, Sanjeev, who finally I convinced him to come on the video, by the way. This is his first video.
This is a big deal.
Chicago.
Sanjeev, wave. This is your first video appearance.
Yeah, this is my first video appearance. Yes, finally convinced me.
Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you so much.
So a big thanks to our sponsors for making our procurement series talk possible. A couple housekeeping notes before I switch things over to Anna. She's going to kick off our panel. Brandon George on my marketing team is managing our technology for the day. We do have a couple polls that we've prepared. We want to make sure our session is lively and interactive. He'll be managing those polls. We're going to do one at the beginning and one to close us out. And we want this to be a lively discussion. So feel free to use the chat function and banter between yourselves in the audience and with our panelists. And then we have a Q&A function as well. So please keep your questions coming and ask them throughout. Brandon will also be managing the questions and directing them at the appropriate panelists throughout our discussion. The panel will last about an hour. We are live streaming our event and recording the session, so we'll be able to share it with you and your colleagues after via YouTube on all of our social channels. Now I'm going to turn our panel over to Anna McGovern, who's our moderator for the day. And I'd like her to introduce herself, but before she does, I have a couple fun facts to share about Anna. And those who know me well know I'm always big on sharing personal facts. I think one of the amazing things about our procurement industry is building those personal connections. So Anna is an Yankees fanatic. She's not in any of her Yankees gear today, but she's a huge, huge fan. Anna is also a baseball and orchestra mom. And Anna, I want to hear a little bit more about the orchestra play because that's kind of unique. And she and her hubby got married 10 months to the day after their first date. And they got engaged 3 months after knowing each other. And they're going to celebrate their 20 years of marriage in June. So a big, big accomplishment. And this is something I think is kind of a funny story about Anna. Early in her career, she worked in an industrials, plastic, and unionized manufacturing facility. There was a union strike, and as a salaried management employee, she worked in the factory to actually keep the lines running. Her job was to run lines of rubber gasket along a steel frame. Now, she had to carry and haul 50 to 100 pounds of rubber gasket around. The lesson that she learned is she is not cut out for manual labor. So with that, Anna, I'm going to turn the panel discussion over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sarah. Those are some fun facts that you've shared. I really appreciate it. So I really appreciate that you put on these procurement talks. I think it's fabulous that we get to share best practice with such high caliber people in our industry. As you've heard me say before, procurement used to be the bridesmaid and now we're the bride. So I'm just happy that we've arrived. So just a little bit about me. I am the managing director of Pondview Consulting. It's a boutique consulting firm for procurement and supply chain specifically. I have been in supply chain for the better part of 30 years. I grew up in consumer packaged goods. My particular expertise along the supply chain highway is really in supply chain planning, so S&OP, demand and supply planning, and of course, I've spent half my career in strategic procurement. So that's where I've cut my teeth. I spent the majority of my career working for Unilever across all of their categories in home, personal care, foods, ice cream. And more recently, I've been in the beauty, cosmetics, and fragrance space, working for Arcade Beauty in Manhattan, where I was leading the procurement and the supply chain function. So I'm pleased to moderate today's discussion. I'm delighted to be among such high caliber talent today. I thank you all ahead for being with us. Before we get to the poll, let me just tell you what today's theme is going to be about. So we're exploring the whole concept of managing disruption and supply chain risk. Obviously, COVID continues to be top of mind, but now that we're in new normal, what happens next? So during times of crisis, CEOs and the leadership teams typically are relying on their supply chain and procurement leadership to really protect their revenue streams. So what do we do to do that, right? So a robust risk mitigation process as part of everyday running of the business is critical. So this is the key theme, and I will be going around after the poll asking what next. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Brandon so that he can run the poll.
All right, so it is live and launched. You should see it on your screen, but the first question I wanted to ask is, in light of COVID, do you feel your team is prepared for the next major disruption? So far, it seems like most people are getting there, but still kind of hoping to learn some new ideas during this panel discussion. Nobody's in denial, so that's good to see on the fourth and final choice there.
All right, Anna, we'll turn it back over to you. We'll keep the poll live for a couple more minutes, and Brandon can let us know the results at the end.
Excellent, excellent. So now that we're in this new normal, it's time to get back to work. So slowly the world and the country is opening back up, and businesses are preparing, HR leaders are preparing for bringing people back to work. So what does work look like in the post-COVID environment? So Jay, I'd like to have Jay Gaddis start with the first question. Jay, if you would please introduce yourself, and then I'll ask you this question that you can answer once you've introduced yourself. So in the near term, getting back to work, what does that mean for simple things like the workforce and the workplace? What does it mean to even have a cafeteria in your work environment? So I'll turn it over to you to answer or introduce yourself and then answer the question. Jay, I think you're muted. There you are.
Apologies.
That's okay.
Well, what I was apologizing for. Thank you, Anna. I wanted to thank you for that and welcome all of our participants today. A little bit about myself. First of all, as we all know in procurement, you have to be prepared for whatever comes at you. And as you can tell, I am currently not on the video because I'm having issues with my laptop today. So I hope everyone can kind of see the humor in that, because of course we've had practice and we've talked and I've worked through the Zoom and it worked great until today. So Murphy's Law, but you know, the procurement professionals, we're used to doing what we need to do to assure that we're successful in whatever we're doing. So I'm ad-libbing with that right now. Again, my name is Jay Gaddis, and I am currently the Director for Global Indirect Procurement at Cook Medical. I have been with Cook for just a few months, but I've been in the procurement roles for about 34 years now, and have a background in automotive and aerospace as now in the medical field. So all those things have one thing in common, and they're regulated. So you can see kind of the challenges with that as we're getting ready to go back to work in the office and so forth, as well as other companies. So your question that you asked, Anna, around, you know, folks, what do you do? Are you ready to go back? Something that seems probably simple to know to most people, and they may not be thinking about it, but an example would be your cafeteria that you have at work. So I think people should be prepared for the fact that it's probably going to look different after the COVID-19. You'll see cafeterias offering box lunches. They'll have individual utilities that are wrapped, you know, not just where you go grab out of a little basket, a knife, a fork, or a spoon as you need it. Those will and should be individually wrapped, or a packet that has all three in one. You'll see, depending on the size of tables and the 6-foot distance, social distancing that we're working around, 1 to 2 people per table. So it's going to look very different. And I know in most companies, a lot of folks took that time to socialize, just personally, have a friend at work or someone that they work with, they just want to get to know better, or possibly that's a time to even have a meeting during lunch. And I think that's going to look a little different because of the social distancing requirement of 6 feet. You'll see areas marked just like you would at your supermarket right now or department store. There'll be X's. There's, you know, defining a 6-foot distance when you're waiting in line just to check out for your food. I think there'll not be any more buffet or self-serve salad bars, for example, at the cafeterias because of the possible contamination and so forth. I think that's going to look a little different. You'll probably see plastic panels and so forth, you know, like you do at your gas station, your grocery store, your bank, where it's dividing yourself from the food and the actual cafeteria workers. You'll see facilities will have hand sanitizers all throughout the facilities. Some may already have had them for, you know, for cleanliness purposes, but if not, you'll see either bottles or those stands that have where you can readily walk underneath it, put your hand underneath, and it dispenses the sanitizers. So what does that look like also if you think about that? So more employees will probably be bringing their lunch. So that's going to look a little different as well, because when employees bring their lunch, if you're thinking ahead, you're not going to be able to leave any of your leftovers for the next day in the refrigerator because the facilities are going to be needing to clean everything thoroughly in between shifts or from the first shift until the next day. So it's probably going to be a demand that you take home your containers every single day. You take home your lunch boxes that you bring in each day. I think areas like your break areas, your coffee areas are going to be very similar. They're not going to want people to stand around, you know, the old saying of standing around the water cooler talking, you know, amongst yourself. That could be said for coffee. I know in the previous time I might stand and get a cup of coffee and talk to a coworker, and I think that's going to look a little different because of the 6-foot distancing that you'll need to do now. I think more people will also spend time at their desks opposed to taking an actual lunch. So there's some pros and cons when you think about these things that could look differently. And if they're taking their lunches, they're probably going to sit at their desk and eat through their lunch, so you're not taking the breaks that you probably should be taking. And then your to-go containers. I think that's going to be something that each company, I'm on the indirect side, so these are fit within my area. And I can tell you prior to COVID, when you were trying to do something that was on a green nature, whether it be compostable or you know, recyclable, those were already getting difficult to find prior to the COVID, and they were quite a bit more expensive, up to 50 to 100% more expensive. And now we have post. I'm not sure what that's going to look like, but I'm pretty sure that the demand's going to be high, and there's not going to be a lot of containers to be available to folks, especially if you don't have a long-term contract with a company, and your price is going to go up. So in conclusion, I think one of the things to think about, there's some pros and cons, but from an indirect side, a procurement side, I think you want to look and budget for your costs to go up in certain areas, and then it may go down in other areas.
Thank you so much, Jay. That was really eye-opening, because these are a lot of little things that we take for granted, right? So, I mean, I hosted a Memorial Day picnic this weekend, and the things I had to think about how to handle food, doing it outside, making sure utensils were individually wrapped and so on. So lots and lots of things that we probably didn't even think about. So thank you for going through that. Now, let me shift and pivot a little bit. Because we're here, we're in the new normal. And last week, you probably have all seen that Gartner announced their 2020 top 25 world supply chains. what they said, not surprisingly, is that the common thread among the top 25 is how they deal with disruption. And there were 4 criteria that linked the top 25. So essentially, there were 70% of the companies in the top 25 that had a dedicated center of excellence for their procurement and their supply chain function. 90% had implemented or upgraded their supply chain technology and their procurement and spend visibility. 90% had advanced analytics and big data initiatives. And finally, 85% of those in the top 25 had supply chain ownership of program and change management initiatives. Now, Dave, I'm gonna shift to you based on this. First of all, introduce yourself, and then the question is going to be that technology and being flexible and agile really is going to be a key requirement going forward. Those that don't start using analytics are not going to be able to survive for the long term. So that's the key enabler. So with everything moving to a digital world, including vendor payments, and I was shocked to learn recently that still 60% of firms cut actual paper checks. So with everything moving to digital, how have you dealt with instances of cybersecurity that may have compromised your systems and or the payment, the procure to pay stream?
And don't run off when you're done, Dave, because I've got some questions lined up for you.
Okay, glad to answer them. Yeah. So thanks again, everybody, and glad to join the conference and the chat here this afternoon. It's a great forum and format of questions here. So first off, an introduction. My name is Dave Stowe. I've been the Chief Procurement Officer for a couple life science companies over the last couple of years, one with Purdue Pharma, which is here in the East Coast in Connecticut, and another one with Horizon Therapeutics in the Chicago area. And prior to that, I was with PwC in their life science practice, working on a number of engagements with clients around the supply chain, as well as procurement, sourcing, procurement operating model. And as you just alluded to here, Anna, we're going digital with a lot of things, and procure to pay is an important area of processing, but also risk. And I think it's important for us to take a look at the whole entire, what I call source to pay. And a lot of times we get caught up with how we're going to source things, and it's very important to look at the source to contract. As Jay just talked about, an important area of the cafeteria and how we're going to look at those as a corporation, especially large companies. However, as we look at this procure to pay area and as we move more to digital, there's a need to do that for areas of efficiency. When you start to grow as a company and as you get bigger and bigger, small companies might be able to cut the physical checks, but really it's got to go digital nowadays, and people are getting more and more used to that. And there's a lot of nice system features across the board with a lot of different technologies for suppliers to track their payments, to know when they're going to get paid and to see the cash. So their order to cash improves, as well as the efficiency of the procure to pay. However, there's a lot of cyber risk out there, and it's important to think about processes and systems combined. So just putting in an actual system itself is not efficient. You have to think through the process, especially of vendor onboarding and vendor master data file maintenance. It's kind of like one of those mundane things that we get into, and we almost can start to pull our hair out or get frustrated because we need to update that information. Vendors, they normally change their bank accounts, just probability wise, especially the larger your vendor database becomes. So how you manage that is very important. And I had a situation a while back, I won't disclose a lot of the details in there, but there was a person in the managing the vendor master database, and as this information comes in to set up new vendors, as well as to adjust the vendor information. The company was growing rapidly, and for a variety of reasons, this person was doing the best that they could do in an environment where really it was more of a process issue. And way back when in my career, I started I worked for Subaru in the automotive industry, and I learned early on from Deming that processes really drive a lot of behavior, and they also can drive the probability of high error rate that has nothing to do with the person. But we do get wrapped around sometimes that that person make an error. But in this particular situation, there was an email that came in, and we get these emails all the time, but a lot of phishing emails, and they're scams and all that. But a really sharp, and this is, I think, we have to think about is that our data security is very important. And while we can talk about work with our IT team and we can work with accounts payable, how do we have a process set up to make sure that the information that somebody sends in an email is correct, especially if they're going to change their banking information and we're going to wire money to a new bank account. So in this situation, we came into an environment where this person got the email and said, hey, you know what, we just updated our bank account. Could you please change the bank account to whatever the number was? And this person was pretty wise, worked in this role for a long time in other companies, and sent an email internally to the stakeholders to ask them to clarify, hey, this vendor, we'll just call him vendor A, just sent us an email and said, hey, we need to change our bank account. Are you okay with it? And in this kind of fast moving environment where you're setting up, 2 to 3 new vendors a day, where you're starting to have a lot of vendor changes going on, you're starting to really grow as a company. And in life sciences, you get these inflection points where the revenue can just grow fast, but that means also the spend's growing fast. So all of a sudden, out of the blue, they say, internally they say, that seems reasonable. And the person, again, in the vendor master was saying, are you really sure? And they said, yes. So without any processes, without any policies in place, with a rapidly growing kind of environment, they said, okay, you're sure? And they said, yes. So they changed the bank account. Well, guess what? It was a fraud. And a week later, when they wired the money, they wired it to a different bank account. And it was, a 6-figure number. It wasn't a, break the company type thing, but, fraud is fraud. So it's a publicly traded company that I was with. And all of a sudden, obviously, the internal audit bells are going to go off. This is going to escalate very fast to the executive suite. The CFO is obviously involved right away, the controllers. You can imagine a lot of financial controls. And in this environment where I was going at in this story here, for us to know in purchasing is think through that process. What is the process and how do we validate? And how much do we know about validating the person on the other side of an email? It sounds really odd, but actually these cyber criminals, probably are really very savvy. They're driven more by state entities maybe than individuals. We don't know who they are. They could be anywhere in the world. They could be right next door to us here in the US. They could be outside of the US, wherever it is. But anyway, where I was kind of going at is you start to realize this is going on. The next question to say is, okay, we've got to really start to understand that. But it becomes a process discussion. It becomes a very, one that's very important for us to talk about how we would validate that, work with the banks, work with, best practices in that environment. And start to realize that then we have to educate also other people that are receiving information, because in a environment that's growing fast and depending on how things are set up, you can have technology, again, even have the vendors update through good security practices, update their information, but we really need to think about how we then communicate with the different stakeholders, the suppliers, the people that are in, the financial world of the company, as well as the people that might be interacting with those vendors. And again, in a situation where you've got more on the indirect side with a lot of different vendors being set up for a variety of very good reasons, trying to figure out who's telling the truth and who's not can be challenging. So I found that, again, I had to step back and say, guys, it's a process issue. What happened? Where are we going? And let's talk about then the policy. But then work together to start to really build more checks and balances in the processes with the systems, as opposed to just saying it was a bad person or somebody made a mistake, don't do it again. It's really got to be thought through. And so I encourage us as procurement professionals to be thinking about that angle. And more things are going to go digital. It's just a matter of time. And payments is one thing. We can expand this into any other piece of information that we look at. It's digital. It's just going to move fast, and if it gets in the wrong hands, it's dangerous.
Thank you, Dave. That's clearly a worry for a lot of companies at this point that are not as mature in their processes. So it's absolutely a crystal clear area that we need to focus on. Okay, so now let's shift a little bit.
A couple questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Brandon, you wanted to answer some questions. Yes.
So we'll let Dave start, and then we can kind of open it up. Do you find that companies are pulling back on their IT spend right now and focusing on just keeping the lights on? Also, what are some of the the bigger challenges y'all have seen from a procurement perspective to support all of these workers who now find themselves as remote workers?
Well, maybe I'll just answer kind of the first question about IT, and then maybe the panel can chime in on some other thoughts. So I don't think that IT would be an area that companies want to start to cut back on. What I have found is that when you take a look at a budget, and I think IT is going to have to increase, and this is where it always gets dicey, but if you have, for example, a good category plan and you know your category that you're managing, and there's an IT need in it. And I know in life sciences, we get into a lot of software as a service type of situations with a lot of different vendors. So it brings in kind of a technology component as well as a service component. Taking the time to really understand what that means and the true cost is again, a core part of our process. It's challenging in this time because, we're sitting at home or we're sitting wherever we can to try to field information with our colleagues and our team. But I would also say that, this is probably not an area that at least I've seen cutting back, but I think there's other areas that probably are getting really cut. For example, travel and hotel and all that other stuff. That stuff you can easily say, okay, if we used to spend, and a company a size that's maybe about $1.5 billion in revenue might spend, maybe about $10 to $20 million, maybe more on $30 million on travel and travel expense. You could pull that money out of that, and you've got something you can work with if you need it for IT. So I think probably in my mind, IT is not the area. I think it's going to be other areas in that space of travel. Probably Jay talked about, cafeterias. I'm sure that the cost will go up when we come back to work. Right now, there's no cost there, I think, or low cost, I should say. The maintenance on a building, those are going to be question marks going forward. So I think the budgets around the corporate world are going to change, but I don't think IT is going to be cut in my mind. So that's my opinion.
Tim or Larry or Jay, do you have a point of view? Let me start with Tim on this one.
Thanks, Anna. I think realistically, I think there's a step before cut. Any company is using this opportunity right now to review and either decide, what should be cut, what should be kept, or what portion of anything should be kept, and every cost to be justified. And so I think IT, like every other part of the budget, is being looked at by every company, and this is a great opportunity to do that. I think to Dave's point, I think folks that are in process on a digital transformation of any kind, it'll be tough to cut those. Realistically, companies are going to have to accelerate those spends, in my view. But I think broadly, every company is looking for opportunities to cut what can be cut right now, whether they're doing well in this environment or not. It's just there are these unique opportunities to not waste a crisis, and this is one of those opportunities. But I think how IT is done, there are a lot of digital laggards, I think, out there. I think that, as we've talked about mid-market and, on this group, I've seen and observed on LinkedIn and stuff, lots of conversations about the digital laggards that, that I think if you're doing the wrong thing in IT and this exposes that, if COVID exposes that, then I could see a shift. It may not be a cut, but I could see things on the roadmap that they might have changing to be more reflective of where they should be going and what this has exposed. But I'm with Dave. It's not, I suspect that's not the budget at the end of the day. That's smaller. I just think that there could be changes to it, or in fact, larger in some spots.
Okay, great. Actually, you know what? This conversation is turning right into the question that I want to ask you, Tim. So if you'll introduce yourself, and then the question that I want you to answer for the group is really, as we talk about the new normal, what does that really mean? So if we focus on the next 12 to 18 months, let's say post-COVID, and then maybe take a look at 5 to 10 years, what does that mean to the shift in the supply chain in terms of crisis management or preparing for risk mitigation? So I think what you've been saying sort of leads right into that. So if you'll introduce yourself and then maybe tell us a little bit more about what you think is happening next.
I don't have a good crystal ball, Anna. So my name is Tim Herod. am an accountant, so I'll start with that. I haven't done accounting for 20 some years, but it gives you a sense of my background and foundations, and maybe a bit of my last answer. I think so. I've been in investor relations for 5 years. I then led a treasury transformation. I then had the opportunity to lead a procurement transformation. All of that with a company called Potash Corp, which was the world's largest fertilizer company. Mining, mills, chemical plants, a lot of industrial spend in a decentralized world where these plant leaders don't like to change. So it's a really interesting opportunity, on a new digital foundation to take, 20 different ways of doing things and trying to create one way and then get value out of that one way. And then had an opportunity following that as in a lead role as a procurement leader, the head of procurement for Nutrien, which is the product of a merger of equals. And if we want to talk about the topic of this presentation, there's a lot to learn out of a merger of equals. But that one was also, we had the largest synergy target procurement did, and trying to bring two companies together, trying to take a digital first approach and do that successfully was an interesting challenge. Now I'm a part of the Bain Advisor Network. I'm a consultant that works a little bit with Bain right now, but mostly I'm directly contracted to lead another procurement transformation, multi-billion-dollar, different type of company. Has a large goods for resale component, very large Western Canadian, 1.9 million member retail cooperative that does a bunch of different things. So seeing lots of different parts of this crisis unfold in different customer markets as well. This company runs a large refinery or owns a large refinery and manufactures a bunch of stuff to feed into its customer base. So I got lots of different lenses to this, Anna, in terms of the question about what does the future, where are we and where are we going from what I think is a procurement and supply chain perspective. I will just start with a view, which is it's not going to be the same as it was, not to make a really obvious statement. But I think there's a lot of things that are different, and it creates this opportunity to add value. If procurement can add value in this environment, then you should probably not be in procurement, in my opinion. I'll just say that. I think the business needs value. Suppliers increasingly in the visibility of your suppliers that used to do certain things that may not exist today and may not exist tomorrow. The turnover in the supply market is going to be substantial. There's a lot of risk associated with that procurement and supply chain are best positioned to see, to come to the table with ideas on what to do about that, and to actually help the business execute on that when the business itself needs to pay a lot of attention about the business and much less attention about, it just is not going to have time to solve these procurement and supply chain problems. So really great opportunity to bring a lens to the table that says we can help identify value, we can partner with you the right way, and we can do that as it changes, because this is going to be quite a changing environment over the next 12 to 18 months. So I think most businesses, as you saw in the survey that Brandon laid out, have stabilized. The question is, we're in a recession, and for whatever particular business, the nature of the recession is very different. This isn't an economic bubble bursting where everybody's at work, where fewer people are at work, but work is the same. Just the demand is less. Well, now we can't go to work the same way. We can't consume the same way. The demand has fundamentally changed, and there are things that are going to impact, as we know, and we're seeing pockets of the economy differently than other pockets of the economy. So depending, and it's going to be so individual and so local in a way that I don't think we've been challenged before. So we have to know what's going on, from the perspective of what is a global supplier, what is a regional supplier, what is a local supplier. What do we not know about what's going on out there that we really should know to help our business in the best way? I think that's the opportunity to add value, to help the business create value, to preserve value, and to get on the front foot in terms of identifying advantages in the new world that if you can make that pivot faster, and we can be a part of that at the table, then I think that's gonna be a big winner for the function. And again, as I said this a couple of weeks ago in a session, the laggards are gonna be exposed. And so those that can pivot are going to create competitive advantage for their business and value. Those that are not are going to be opportunities for new leadership, or they're not going to exist anymore. So I think when I look at, I think the whole function, and this is one of the things I'm doing with this team we're building, is what happened in the last recession. What parts of that, can we steal from, sort of what did we learn about what our customers did? What did we learn about what our suppliers did? And then look at the macro and the micro things that are changing. And, whether it's from a government perspective, whether, what's going to happen on the big things with respect to people, with respect to all of the sort of the macro things, property, what are people allowed to do? What aren't they? What happens in terms of global cooperation and taxation and imports and exports, and where do people live? Where do they work? Which Jay talked about earlier. Those are some of the macro setting. Then what does it mean in terms of what are we able to do from a digital and tech perspective? What happens in particular industries that are going to do really well, like medical, healthcare, science, that have been underinvested in? What is that going to mean in the new world? What does it mean in terms of accelerating an energy transformation, in terms of the energy industry, the food system, human behavior, education, work and work platforms, entertainment, grocery, dining, all of these things that, what matters to our business, and what does a new world look like, and what are the range of options, and how do we help the organization think about those things? I don't have any answers in the crystal ball, Anna, but it's something that we are sitting in a unique position to have visibility where others in the organization don't have it. And we can accelerate turning that visibility into value because we touch the dollars. And I think it's just a really unique time for the function. So I'll stop there. That's a long answer.
No, that was extraordinarily insightful. I think there's a fundamental shift in how we go about the business of managing risk. If we don't manage it proactively, I think we're going to perish. And Dave, I think you've done some work in this space. If I can just shift back to you, just in the interest of the topic continuing, you've done a lot of work with establishing end-to-end processes for mitigating risk from the onset. So you start with protecting the revenue stream, and there's cross-functional work streams that are inherent in the organization to mitigate risk going forward. Can you talk about that, and then specifically home in on the supplier end of things, and how you proactively manage risk with supply base?
Sure, no, and I think I want to key in on what Tim was just saying here. He mentioned procurement we have and supply chain, we have a great opportunity to look at data and take that visibility and really turn it into value is a key thing here. And I found that kind of knowing how to manage with, data and use the data is important to building a collaborative environment with colleagues. And, we can use COVID maybe as a good example, is that there's a lot of unknowns and it's very foreign. I mean, 3 months ago when somebody would say, hey, 2020 is going to be a disaster year, you're sitting there at the end of January and you're going, things seem pretty good here. I'm not sure what's going on with this weird virus coming out of Asia and China, but it seems fine. And now it's obviously changed dramatically. We all know that. But now do we have that information? What do we do with it? So one of the things that I've done is I have a simple way of looking at data. Good data analytics leads to good collaboration, leads to partnership. And you need to use that data to engage other colleagues and suppliers in trying to find the truth or whatever the real issues are. And there's always a lot of perceptions. There's always going to be perceptions. There's always going to be misinformation. There is going to be times when you think you're very much on the mark with your analysis and somebody comes in and they convince you that, no, you missed it. And I think being open to that is important. When you get into that cross-functional way of looking at supply risk, it's a very important mindset to have as you go into a discussion with your colleagues. I think what I have found is that, there's the typical, maybe maturity path that we talk about an organization has to kind of go through. And they have to kind of develop a little bit of that muscle memory. And a good organization, that's really, you think of some of the blue chip companies that are dealing with supply risk right now, and I'll just, because I don't know much about it other than I have an Apple iPhone, and that's my connection with Apple. But I think there's a certain level where you can see a big company like that that's been doing this for a long time has developed a very robust process. Well, if you're a small life science company and you start to look at your suppliers outside of the US, what does that mean? Or even inside of the US, you still have to answer some similar questions that, you know, a big company has to answer. Even if it's not the same industry that you're in, there's always a regulatory oversight that's different from consumer electronics to pharmaceutical products or medical devices. But there's also other questions that go into there about the viability of that supplier, their quality, their reputation for quality, what they bring to the table, their collaboration with your colleagues. We talked about data security just a while back. There's a lot of data that's shared with any company nowadays. How is that shared? So again, what I found is, you know, it sounds like it's simple, but process maps really help drive clarity. I think data helps enforce that. You know, while I have had a lot of experience in what I call Lean Six Sigma or the Toyota production system, I don't try to talk about that technique so much as just the common sense approach to doing things. And I found that usually appeals to the colleagues you're trying to influence, right? And the masses of people that just kind of see common sense for what it is. But data helps drive that clarity, and then people start answering questions. And then perceptions that might have been falsely created, you don't have to really get into huge arguments with them. You aren't debates, but it can be more, you know, data driven and less, say, confrontational. And that's what's important here, especially when you get into very challenging times like we're in right now, is you have to know what data is valid, and you have to think that through and almost question it over and over. That's how I've looked at some supply risk issues and having to manage, you know, the company through that maturity path and develop it I call it muscle memory, just like an athlete, how he or she is really developing the strength to compete when you really need to.
Thank you, Dave, for that very insightful answer. It's critical, and it leads to the topic of communication with internal and external stakeholders. So Larry, I'd like to turn over to you now. Thank you for sitting there waiting patiently. I love the headset. Love your library in the background.
Thank you, guys.
But I know you've done quite a bit of work, Larry, in your career in procurement with basically establishing processes. And you know the critical importance of engaging internal stakeholders as well as your external stakeholders. Can you talk about the communication protocols that you put in place to make sure that there's that seamless interaction, you know, as you've been looking at processes to mitigate supplier risk and supply risk in general?
Yeah, I think I should be able to do that. And with that, I'll give you a quick introduction of myself. I'm Larry Lung. I'm here based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I work for a beverage alcohol monopoly distribution retailer that's owned by the government of Ontario, or so it's a state kind of run thing. And we buy or purchase the second like in terms of volume and spend of beverage alcohol across the planet. So it's a nice place to be given a pandemic. People still need to drink, and hopefully drink responsibly. And yeah, and my career here is that's where I'm currently at. But I've spent a number of I've had a number of roles across a number of organizations, including financial services, a pension fund, a newspaper, the government, both the municipal and provincial government, doing a number of tasks or completing a number of objectives, including contract management, vendor management, strategic sourcing, and most recently, and still to this day, procurement. And what I want to talk about, I guess, is this idea of communicating with your internal or external stakeholders, and what does that mean, and how do you build relationships if you don't do it already really well. I think it's this idea, and salespeople do it really the best, I guess, because they have a process of continually contacting their prospects. And I think internally in procurement, we need, I've found it successful to continue to not prospect my internal stakeholders, but essentially continue to follow up with them on a regular basis about non-work related items as well, in order to build that rapport. Because the more I know about their family or their issues or their challenges about work or whatever it is, the better relationship I'm going to have, and the greater insights they're able to give me to the other people in the organization that they have influence over. So having said that, the number of risk types out there are immense, from financial, insurance, cyber, privacy, the kind of like keeping personal information private from anyone else, logistics, supply chain risk. All of these types of risk are owned by the different departments and divisions across an organization, and procurement touches all of them, but doesn't own most of them, besides potentially the delivery of indirect services, or at least in my case, the delivery of indirect services. But having a pulse on where all the different risk elements are across an organization, and sharing these risk matrices that I've been able to do by, first of all, getting buy-in to that. Hey, can you share the risks that your organization faces with other areas, not siloed, but sometimes siloed areas of the organization, so that there's a massive amount of brain power and knowledge within an organization. And I've felt and learned from a number of people that aren't that although they reside in finance, they have great insights to supply chain, or they're in sales and marketing, but they have great insights into finances or supply chain, just because of the background and other experiences they've had in their career. And looking at other people's risks, and not to say that, hey, you're doing it wrong. It's more like, hey, what about this view or this lens that they can apply to? And basically putting all of this on a SharePoint custom list with department, division, risk type, and thoughts about this from the main ownership of the risk owner, followed by thoughts by from this department, if you want to chime in about it, just so that it gives this risk element a greater I guess, purview to expand upon within the ownership risk area. So yeah, that's pretty much it that I was able to help institute. It took a very long time, because typically, BCP has ownership of a lot of areas, and generally it doesn't really share it with anyone else, or at least in my experience. And it's taken a long time to come and to get significant buy-in across the organization, and we're not complete yet. There's definitely people that aren't willing or aren't willing yet to share information about their risks that they see in their organization. But for those that have, they've found value in getting other insights and other input from non-ownership areas of the risk. And then the nice thing about using a SharePoint is that you can cascade it into a simple dashboard, and make it fairly simply for the people that you need to share it with. Yeah, that's pretty much the thing I wanted to share about today.
Thank you so much, Larry. Appreciate that input. We do have a question from the audience that I think, Tim, I'd like for you to tackle. It says, how should we reduce our prices or leverage from our suppliers? If we see in this COVID situation that there is an urgent need for business to reduce prices to continue to retain the business and make the product more cost effective for the end user.
Well, that's the billion-dollar question, or more. I think it depends. It depends on what it is that we're talking about. In my opinion, I think the ability to cut costs in a competitive landscape really depends on what it is that we're talking about. There are things. So in a business, there are things that are more expensive today than they were yet, before the crisis, and demand is high, and there's a lot of competition, and a supplier is not going to give up that value if they don't have to. On the other hand, and we're seeing this, for example, and this is what all of my answers are. It depends on what we're talking about. When you look at oil and gas, and you look at cost in a refinery, for example, or in anything industrial on the goods and services for own use side, on the indirect side, there's a lot of supply, and demand has dropped off a cliff. So both for goods and services. So in an environment like that, on one hand, you'll have critical suppliers where they may be small, they may be large, but if they're critical, if cutting if going after them for value is going to cause them to not exist tomorrow and they're critical, that's a risk that you have to take. So maybe that's not the best place to aim for cost reduction if it's really going to add cost and over a life cycle to your business from a total cost of ownership perspective. But there are, there are opportunities to create more competition. There are targeted areas that one can use digital to actually partner better with that supplier to say, look, let's work together. We didn't really have the right incentives aligned before, the right motivation before, the time before, where now we can really work together to identify and scrub cost out and share in those cost reductions. I think those opportunities are more plentiful today than they were before, because everybody needs to cut costs in this environment where demand is, if demand is off a cliff, what do we do if we want to survive? There are some, this is an opportunity where you can look at new suppliers, and the cost cut comes because, we were really married to somebody. We just have this opportunity now to do something different. We never really took a hard look before. We never really had the visibility, and this gets back to, we're pretty big on supplier visibility right now, and we're investing in the supplier master and the supplier universe landscape. How do we discover new suppliers? And you can find suppliers that are doing it better, smarter, faster, and that can reduce cost. And that supplier could do well in that environment. So there are different ways to look at it. I think you have to be strategic, use your data, as Dave said. Like it all comes down to, where do you aim first? You have limited resources, and you have to have impact quickly. It comes down to data-driven decisions and using technology to be as smart as possible with that. But identifying the right suppliers to partner with, that you can work together on that. Identify new suppliers that are just better, smarter, faster, and less expensive. And then there's some suppliers that aren't going to make it, and which ones of those can you afford to lose, and be really smart about that. So different ways to answer that question depending on your situation.
Yeah, Larry or Jay, do you have a point of view on managing price reductions in this environment? Or do you have a particular example you'd like to highlight?
Anna, sure, thank you for asking. I believe right now what we found was the need for immediate cost savings. I think each company right now is, because this hit so quickly and most were not prepared for this, and then the sudden downturn, depending on your business, of course, in sales and revenue. I can tell you most of the leaders are going to be looking for that quick cost savings, and most of the time that means they're going to turn to the indirect side. So although I've been in the direct world, I can speak to both on that. Partly because I think some of the other folks, Tim and Dave and Larry, talked about this, but the regulations. If you're in an industry that requires stringent regulations, then it's time consuming to make a change, for whether it's a design or a material or so forth. So it's just natural for executives to look for the indirect side. And I think that's very common and fair enough, because we can react quicker. But the downside to that is that sometimes, often, your low-hanging fruit from a while back when you did some cost savings activities. So it's sometimes you've already been down that path. So it's hard to say. And again, like Tim said, it depends. The answer is always going to depend on the industry and so forth. But I think that's one thing that we as procurement folks should be aware of. And things just this will come up later, but things like office supplies, where some of your spend is going to be naturally downward, where some of it would go upward. And if it's going upward, use those contracts that you currently have in place and go back to them and talk about use your leverage of your demand. If your demand has gone up, masks and gloves and so forth that companies use in manufacturing to do their daily work, let alone the individuals that need them now. See if you can use some of that for your leverage for making a long-term contract that's going to look very feasible to the suppliers, because some of this may go away and they won't see the demand on as high as they do today. So talking to those folks and that relationship, always go back to your relationship with your supply base, where you have that, and use that leverage to look at going forward. What does it look like? And then that is another way to look at your cost savings.
Thank you, Jay. Larry, did you have a point of view?
Yeah, the cost savings element, we haven't, at least it hasn't been communicated overly to myself, because we're a fairly lean organization, because of all of our profits get attributed back to the government. So even though we have about I think a $5 billion US or $6.3 billion Canadian revenue annually, I think we issue a dividend in the vicinity of like $2.3 billion Canadian back to the government. So our expenses are fairly tight, and I think they're not anything that they're not going to add any new projects, but the projects they have are very high priority and strategic in nature. So I don't see any cuts in those areas. We have some marketing elements that are being cut just because we're not doing a lot of print promotion and in-store promotions and stuff like that, but it's still happening. But yeah, our business is stable as people continue to buy beverage alcohol, and in a safe manner, of course, with social distancing markers and everything like that. And there's, our people on the floor are obviously thinking that, you know what, as some people are getting, wages are cut or being unemployed, they may just transfer some of their buying habits from more expensive or premium products to a more value and oriented product. But we don't think that demand is going to drop off entirely for beverage alcohol, but there is definitely potentially going to be some switching to more value oriented products.
Great. Thank you, Larry.
No
There's
problem.
another question from the audience, which I'd like to direct to Jay. And Jay, this is about what are some of the bigger challenges from a procurement perspective to support remote workers? And really, I think what we've seen here is that working from home definitely has its advantages. There are lots and lots of benefits to working from home, but there are also inherent challenges. If you wouldn't mind tackling that question for the group, it would be really great.
Sure, I'm happy to. So I've had the experience of working from home for a few years off and on, different companies that I've worked for prior to the COVID and after COVID. And it's very similar, but I think there are a few differences in this. And one of the things that I've noted is companies that are, and so I'm going to talk about the pros and the cons for the employee as well as the employer, because I think it's important as employees that we think about our employers when we think about things like this, because some folks love working from home. They find it as a perk per se, and others may not be as comfortable with it. So to have that option is always, I think, the best of both worlds on that. But what's very different for now is with the COVID situation, many schools closing, it looks different if you're a parent. So, some of the parents are having a hard time finding childcare, and even if they had a personal person or friend or family member, because of either their risk of getting the COVID, or maybe they actually know someone that got it, so they're a desperate need to have someone to care for their children, while you're working from home can be a challenge. So I think one of the things that the companies have helped with that is employers have said, let's offer some flex hours and flex schedules. And I think that benefits maybe, and it could look different for each individual person, and the company's policies might look different. I think if you put some parameters, for example, your core business hours to be online or around 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. or somewhere in there, and maybe it's 6 a.m. to 3 p.m., but you're covering a big part of that core part, companies are accepting of that because it works for your home life balance. It works for your schedule that you need. And this is unprecedented, obviously, where so many companies were shut down and schools just closed basically on a Friday and said, we don't know when you'll be coming back. So companies to have that flexibility, but also for the parents too, to try to find that balance of when they can get online and have a conversation without the interruptions and so forth. So that's a challenge that I think most companies would say, if you have a little bit of a background, sometimes it's forgiving and it's okay because that's life, right? And I think there's also things that it can cut costs for families right now. Maybe there's one spouse or partner that's working and the other's not, so they've lost an income. And driving back and forth, there is a cost related to that. It's a cost from the standpoint of maybe it is child care costs or wear and tear on your car, road construction avoidance. We know when they've got the highways tore up, that can be so frustrating, and you're kind of in a bad mood before you get into work. And if you're not having to face those challenges and you can just, get up and work from your home, that's a pro because you're not sitting in that traffic. And it also, most of the time, it's going to mean more time with your family. But with that comes, again, a trade-off. Folks that I know personally, I've talked to a lot of professionals, and they almost all say the same thing. I find myself working more hours when I work from home. And then I say, yeah, that's maybe not a positive thing, but in some ways it can be. But I said, let me ask you this question. When you're doing that, are you taking breaks in between? Maybe you're working 10 hours or maybe 12 hours, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. But hopefully what you're finding is your company's flexible and they want you to take those breaks in between. And maybe you're not working that consistent 12 hours. You're on and then you take time to sit down and have a lunch or go out in the backyard with your children to have a picnic lunch. Or you take time to have dinner and then you hop back on. So it's a convenience for the employee, but it's also a benefit to the employer most of the time because you're giving more of your time. I think the studies also show that when you're working from home, it's less personal time off and sick time. So that's a plus for an employer. The plus for the employee is if I'm working from home, and I think most companies' policies are going to be, if you're going to take just an hour to run to get a doctor's appointment, maybe an hour and 15 minutes or something, there's no need to take personal time. You can do that and then make that time up when you get back home. And then you don't miss the time because most of the time our appointments are going to be near to our home than they are near to our workplace. So you don't lose that time of driving back and forth as well too. It's easier for right now during the COVID, it's easier to keep your social distance, just to be frank with it. We talked about that earlier in the cafeteria situation, and every place in your office, you're gonna have to sit 6 feet apart and so forth. In your home, that's one of the things you don't have to worry about right this moment, and from the standpoint of the COVID. But it also talks about, I talk about the work-life balance. I mentioned that just a moment ago, but I'm a big advocate for work-life balance. And I've seen, especially over the last decade, many HR folks, many companies, the leaders within the companies are really looking at what that means and find such a value with the work-life balance. And they find that if people are happy at home, they're happy at work, or happy at work, they're happy at home, that circle of things. But I think there is a lot to show that. And I personally know folks that during the COVID, starting in March, they had not ever worked from home before, and now they are. So the first couple of weeks, and probably even if they're honest, the first month or so was real uncomfortable, and they were just trying to find their way. And now if you talk to them 4, 5, 6 weeks later, they're much more comfortable with it. And they're finding that because of COVID, they've made some adjustments in their personal life anyway. And then they just found that extra time that they can maybe spend with the family and or, maybe put a load of laundry in while you're, waiting on an email to come in. But I think too, if you talk about the win-win standpoint of the pros and cons, for organizations, one of the other things that they've recognized is so much of the businesses now are global. And that means, you're 4, 5, 6, sometimes 10 hours difference. And if you have a global role, which I do, and I know many folks do, you're always adjusting your schedule to work around the other schedules because your morning may be their evening. When you're coming into work should be the time that they're leaving. And we do work with our teams this way. And sometimes I might get on later at night and it's their morning or vice versa. And there's a really good balance with that. And I found that I just don't hear many complaints about that because you try to balance that out and make sure. And that's a win for the company, of course, because they're getting work done, you're having the communication, but it's also a win for the employee because you're actually building a inter-company relationship with your coworkers and your peers.
Yeah, I think what we've now discovered is there's no such thing as work-life balance. It's a work-life blending, really. So it's just one continuous work stream. Yeah, and of course, many of the challenges that I think companies are facing is that they really didn't plan on having to set up people remotely. So that was a big wake-up call, I think, from a technology standpoint. How many people didn't have proper bandwidth? How many people didn't have the right equipment? So I think that's been a real live challenge that we've had to deal with across many different smaller enterprises. I think some of the bigger multinational global companies were very well established. I know I've had a Zoom account and I've been global for since 2010. So it's for some companies it's been a natural transition. For others, it's been a large wake-up call. So thank you for that, Jay. I really appreciate it. I think, Brandon, you're ready to launch another poll, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct. I will do that now. All right, does everyone see that there? So after listening to the panelists speak, kind of gauge how you feel, better or worse, about your ability now to manage risk in this new kind of world we live in.
Okay, so if everybody will answer that question. So in the meantime, I'd like to end with one last question. And I'll start with Dave, but just everybody, if you can do a quick round robin, 30 seconds or so. Buying commodity products, especially with multiple financial instruments and the time that we have, demand is so volatile right now. Different financial instruments, different supply scenarios, different demand scenarios. We get caught either purchasing too much or too little. What's the best way to buy in these times and manage inventory at the same time, whether it's managing too much or too little inventory? Any thoughts from the group? Dave?
Sure. And I think it follows on some of the discussion that we've been having here in the panel just the last 5-10 minutes. And I think one of the things I've found is it's important to have a good category management plan. And one of the things about this is, what are you buying, and defining what you're buying, and then what's the needs that you have and the objectives, but then more importantly, what's the supply market look like? And so when we think about commodities, and oil is a good example, or energy right now, I mean, it's extremely volatile, right? And if you need that fuel for your logistics company, your transportation needs, or whatever, it's extremely challenging. Now, the bigger the company is, they're going to be more sophisticated, but I'll just say in general, again, back to my process kind of mindset here, and a S&OP planning process, kind of a sales and inventory and operating planning process. How do you then take a situation where the prices are moving around on the actual product you're going to buy, but you have to kind of bring that back into what is the actual need. So you got to be coordinated with that whole S&OP process, and you've got to work with other colleagues. Again, data is very important here. So how much are we going to buy on a spot market? If we want to buy futures, especially when you get into commodities and there's a futures market, what are you looking at? Food is another good example where those prices can move around a lot. We're used to it if we're in that commodity mindset and we're dealing with things, but we have to have it integrated. You have to be listening to kind of your colleagues and having those very structured kind of meetings. Now, maybe in a normal world, you might meet once a month and make your planning purchases, and you make your plan, make your purchases, and go forward. I mean, when the market starts moving around a lot, it's almost seems really kind of challenging here, but you got to think smaller units of buy, more frequent buying. What does that look like? And again, more frequent meetings. So that's my approach to trying to look at integrating kind of more that sales, inventory, and operating plan with the volatility of the commodities. And now we don't know. And so you've got to think a little bit more, what's the worst case? You got scenario planning going on. Is it, if the prices continue to fall, what will we do? They bounce fast. Is it going to hurt us? What's going to go on? These are all things where sometimes the market makes a tremendous amount of noise, but maybe it doesn't impact us. We just need to, again, have some perspective using the data that we do have, and the processes and the discussions that we have with our teammates to collaborate.
Integrated business planning is the key. I mean, there's no question about it. You have to have cross-functional integrated business planning in order to address this, and pull all the levers accordingly. Tim, do you have a point of view?
I agree with what you just said, Anna, what Dave said. Planning and forecasting, and and the better data and the more frequency you can do that to get the signal from the customer as to what's really happening in the business, so that and whether it's an internal customer or an external customer, and adjusting as much as possible. The other thing I would add, though, is when it comes to this, most people think about risk, but there's also a big opportunity lens here. Also, is what if you have, Dave mentioned inventory. If you have storage capacity for things, and fundamentally there's value in somebody because of dislocation, you can do something opportunistically that's going to add tremendous value if you're consuming it or selling it. Don't forget about there's opportunity in this risk, in this environment that we can help. With our visibility, with our data, we can help the business capture and the enterprise capture. The other piece that I'll say is it really, I think there are things when you look over the next 12 to 18 months, if there is a vaccine or if there isn't a vaccine, and some of these commodity things are going to take a while to unfold. Isn't going to sort of come back like a normal, sort of normal post-recession. And I'll use an example of, Dave mentioned food. Let's say beef, where demand for meat is probably at home, and it is higher. It's higher, and it'll stay higher. It'll stay 20 to 40% higher perhaps than it has been in the past. But the actual production of this stuff is shoulder to shoulder people at a plant, and COVID spreads in that plant, and the whole industry is disrupted, and it becomes a North American, like 4%. Impact of 4% in the supply actually impacts the entire North American market, and we've seen that. So how do you actually predict, and what insights do you have with those types of suppliers of commodities that you can somehow, as you said, become more integrated in what they're doing and what their situation is. So it's not really a Twitter decision. It's like, that this plan is down and there's 600 sick people, and now you're short or you're on allocation for some extended period of time. Maybe you have to find alternative suppliers and have backup plans in the commodity areas. So that's all I would add to what Dave said. Dave had it spot on.
Thank you, Tim. That was great. And I think, do we have the results of the poll yet, Brandon?
All right, can you see those now?
So I've gained some fresh perspective. That's great. And that's 100% credit to my panelists here. You guys knocked it out of the park. It's definitely a pleasure to learn from all of you. I even learned a lot, which is great, seeing how I'm an old dinosaur at this. Sarah, how much more time do you have?
I think we're good to go. I'm going to close it out. Brandon has the final poll results available for everyone to see. So it looks like our panel did their job and educated our group. We had no one who said, what panelists, how do I get there? What are we talking about? So that's a good sign.
Everyone's aware of where they are and that it's still 2020, unfortunately. So progress. Celebrate the wins.
So with that, on behalf of RSN and our sponsor partners, I want to thank Anna, Tim, Jay, Dave, and Larry for spending an afternoon with us to share their knowledge and some of the train wrecks and nightmares and things they've experienced in their careers. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a big believer in storytelling. I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. We can hear other people's mistakes, so maybe we don't make those, and get some good insights as we navigate the new norm together. So our next procurement talk is June 16th at 4 Eastern time. So if you do want to tune in to our monthly webinar series, our next event will be taking place in June, and we've got a great panel lined up for that as well. So with that, I want to thank everyone for the wonderful event. Again, this has been live streamed, and we will be sharing the video and content on social over the next week, so you'll be able to share this with your peers, and if you didn't have a chance to take notes, you'll be able to play the video and recording back. So with that, thank you everyone, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Sarah, for the opportunity.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Nice to see everybody.